All right. Thank you for that generous welcome, Mark. I appreciate it. Um, this is my second time here at Scrum Masters in the Universe, so thank you for having me back. I'm always excited to share my interesting, I guess as I put it, ideas that I kind of come up with just from all the different places I've gathered experience, both Scrum and not Scrum. So today I'm here to talk to you about one of my favorite topics, which is science. So my talk is titled, What Your Science Teacher Never Taught You About Empiricism. So before we get moving, Mark, am I good? Can you hear me? Can you see my slides? Okay, super. All right. So how many of you folks beat this Agile drum all day long? Experiment, fail fast, test and learn. Try something new. You encourage your teams to experiment, yet you find your teams consistently struggle with experimentation. So I thought we'd start off with a little bit of a chat discussion, and Mark is going to help us out with this here. What are the reasons that your team struggles, or what are the impediments that you see that your team has to really succeeding at experimentation? And actually, Mark, the chat has popped up for me, so it's working. Thank goodness.
So you want people to add in the chat,
Yeah.
Patty?
Yeah. What do you see your team struggling with when it comes to experimentation? What are their obstacles? Fear. Yep. Yeah. Time. Needing to be perfect. Fear of being punished. Oh, Joe, you and me are like on the same wavelength here. We're going to talk about that today. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff around fear, around not having enough time. Anything else? Uncomfortable. Yep. All right. There's one thing that's on my next slide that I haven't seen people bring up, and I'm seriously surprised. Let's be real. Experimentation and failing is risky for leaders. So there's a lot of pressure from outside the team, whether it's direct or indirect, not to experiment. Because the fact of the matter is that mistakes cost a lot of time and money. This is a business after all. So leaders, while they may support the idea of experimentation and possibly encourage it, it's really a struggle for them as well. They're scared too. Let's be even more real about leaders. They create these perfect plans, right? They spend years creating plans that they just want their employees to execute. However, these plans fail as well. This is why we're moving away from project management and into more flexible ways of working, such as Agile and Scrum. Studies show, so the research shows that 85% of projects do not come in on time or on budget. So whether we're experimenting or not, I mean, we're failing, unfortunately. Here's something else to take into consideration, and this came up a lot in the chat. People are afraid. They don't want to be pointed, have fingers pointed at them. They don't want to be called to the carpet. And I don't know about you, but I noticed that there's a huge fear of being fired, especially in larger corporations, and especially when we have messages coming at us through LinkedIn or other media saying layoffs are coming, layoffs are coming. People don't want to give their managers a reason to fire them, right? So they'd rather just do as they're told and try to execute it perfectly. That way they can just kind of move on with their day. But I love to talk about insanity here because this is kind of an insanity type situation. The Scrum Masters are beating this drum. We need to test and learn. We need to innovate. We're agile, folks. Leaders are saying, yeah, okay, you can test and learn, but you know what? Actually, you got to do what I say anyway. And then the developers, the people that are doing the work, are just saying, I just need to do my job. I don't want to get fired. I got to keep my head down, right? And they have their own whys. this is a repeating pattern. We go in circles. This conversation just kind of seems never to go anywhere. We can't escape it. So the big question that I'm here to help you answer today is, why are we in this mess? And I will admit here publicly to those who are here and who may watch this as a recording, this is because of people like me. I caused this problem. And I owe you folks a huge apology and probably some strategies to help you get out of this mess that I put you in. So who am I to create this problem for you, right? Well, as Mark introduced, I'm Patty. I'm currently sitting here in Charlotte, North Carolina. The Panthers won last night, so we talked about that before we come on the call. But yeah, I'm in Charlotte, North Carolina. I hold a bachelor's degree in geology from Hofstra University. So this is on Long Island, where I was born and raised. So I am passionate about data and science and looking for patterns. What truth and stories do this data tell us? After that, I went to, like Mark said, Harvard University, a premier research institution in the United States for education. So I got my master's in science education, and I started my career out as a middle school science teacher. So that's why I'm here today to talk to you about owning science teaching and why we've caused these problems for you. After about a year, I realized that middle school students didn't like somebody standing up in front of them and telling them what to do all day, open the textbook, memorize the answers, and spit it out on a test. So I reached back into my education, as well as continued to do research on student-centered learning. So pulling myself out of the front of the classroom and empowering them to take charge of their own learning, take responsibility for this. Many years later, I realized what I was doing in my classroom was Scrum and Agile. For the Scrum purists, it was probably more like Scrum-Bon-ish, but the parallels were uncanny to me. And this was done without any knowledge of Scrum or Agile or software development at all. This was in the early 2000s when these types of things were in their infancy. I didn't know they existed, but it made sense to me. And I pushed this as far as I possibly could in the public school system here in the US. And I finally left, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But I went into business for myself. I started and grew a small business. And then I used that experience to become a Scrum Master and then an Agile Coach. So I've worked across many industries in many company sizes. So I have a very broad perspective on what's going on out there in the world in terms of Agile and Scrum. And I used all of this experience to start my own consulting firm, where I'm very, very keen on supporting Scrum Master growth. But I do acknowledge that it takes everybody to make Scrum successful. I like to say it takes two hands to clap, but in a lot of situations, there's a lot more than two hands. But you get my point. We're all responsible for this, and I go into companies and I kind of start that conversation. It's not just the Scrum Masters. So in today's backlog, I'm going to talk about how I, as a science teacher, perpetuated this problem you're dealing with. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how I realized I was doing this. And now that we're here in this situation, what can we do about it? So I'll give you some practical tips and ways to think about how you approach your team members, maybe from a different perspective. So that's where we're headed today. So let's get started with it. So a little bit about people like me. And when I say people like me, I'm referring to teachers. Specifically, I was a science teacher. You probably recognize a photo like this. Yeah, it's black and white. Yeah, it's old, but this is a very familiar classroom setting. I will say that for those of us here today that are not in the US, this is going to be a very US-centric perspective. But I want you to kind of think about maybe how your educational experiences were very similar to what we have and had going on here in the US. So you might say, well, this picture is black and white. It looks like it's maybe from the 30s or something. But fast forward to today, it doesn't look very different. And I like to call this the industrial education system. So if you think back to industrialization, which is, the turn of the 1900s-ish, manufacturing was up and coming, and people were pulled out of the agrarian lifestyle into factories, and they had to now all of a sudden work for somebody. So the rules of the game had to change. Somebody was up in the front telling people what to do. They had to get all of these people compliant and following the rules. And this is something that also developed in the public education system. So there's debate whether, the education system was designed for shoving people into the factories afterwards. I don't know that answer, but the parallels are uncanny in how they operate and how the different parties behave. So I stepped into this thinking I'm going to change the world and impart my science knowledge on people. And this is kind of what I showed up to. And I decided that I was going to buck the system. I was going to change the way that I ran my classroom. And this was in the very early 2000s, just to give you some time frame. Again, Scrum was really not on many people's radar at that point. And I pushed this as far as I can. Nobody really paid attention to what I was doing. Nobody cared. I felt like I was on an island by myself, but since I marched to my own drummer, I believed in it and I was willing to keep going with it. So this is not me. I don't have any old pictures, but this is kind of, a science classroom, encouraging students to kind of learn and work together. So I kind of went on my merry way. I lasted about 9 years doing this, but somewhere in year, I would say 3 or 4, somebody came into my classroom and said this to me: "You better be teaching the curriculum or we'll know it by your test scores." So I was kind of surprised because I was teaching my curriculum. The students were doing very well. They were engaged. I don't know. I didn't know this person, so I don't know. They hadn't been in my classroom. They didn't really know what was going on, but obviously they were hearing things. They didn't like what they were hearing, and they decided to, what I call, threaten me. But this gave me a very clear message that we're watching you. We're looking at the data. The data is all that matters. The metrics matter. And we'll know if your metrics are bad, that you're not doing your job. Patty. And, I kind of said, okay, thank you for feedback. I'm doing really well here. But I didn't let that deter me. I pushed this, like I said, as far as I could. However, I never forgot this because I'm still thinking about it today. This is where people, teachers, students, educators, administrators learn to game the metrics, because the metrics are all that matters. So we're going to try to figure out how to make the metrics look good. This is where people are learning to do this. So I just wanted to point that out. And this was a shock to me when I realized this all these years later. So like I said, I left public education and I went into business for myself. And then I ended up in the startup community. And then I ended up in large corporations. And I realized that what I saw going on in the classroom, in schools, is exactly mirrored in what's going on in companies. It's like identical. So I did some serious retrospective with myself and said to myself, where are we going wrong? Where did I go wrong? What can we change so when folks show up into the companies nowadays expecting to be agile, so to speak, to operate on a Scrum team, that they are empowered for success? Where is education going wrong? And I thought back to all the different experiments that I did as a science teacher. And this one stood out to me, bar none. Every year with every class, I would do a lab on the freezing point of water. So I would have them gather up their materials, their beaker, all their ice, their little thermometer, and every so often, 1 minute, I'd have them record the data. Of course, they have a lab write-up, they turn in the labs, I read them, and I'm like, oh my gosh, nobody got the right answer. And if you think about it, what's that about? And I realized I was expecting them to get the correct answer because somebody else long ago decided what the correct answer was. We know what the freezing point of water is, 0 degrees Celsius or 32 degrees Fahrenheit. However, we're trying to fake some type of experiment to get the kids engaged, but we're just having them reproduce results, aren't they? Right? And if they don't get the right answer, they get points off on their assignment. And we say, well, you probably just did something wrong because you couldn't get the answer that somebody got, the official scientist that came up with the conclusion here. So this was a little disturbing to me when I realized this, and I thought about all the labs that I did, and I realized, well, the science experiments that I was doing with them, that I thought I was being so innovative and engaging with, were actually a recipe. And I was teaching children to follow directions to get a precise right answer. So we weren't really doing experiments at all. And I had to take a step back and think about that. Because at the end of the day, when we stood up and had a discussion about the lab assignment and, oh, by the way, why didn't we get 0 degrees or why didn't we get 32 degrees? We had to talk about the sources of error. I don't know if this rings any bells with you, but it's always, well, you didn't read the thermometer right, or you didn't do this right, or you didn't use any of the equipment right in any of the labs. So it was always on the student to make the corrections as to why they didn't get the right answer. And if they didn't, they would get a bad grade. So what lesson was I trying to teach them here, right? But this translates into your adult corporate life. You have been trained to reproduce somebody else's results. You get penalized if you don't. So getting the right answer becomes the only thing that's important. When you talk about metrics, right? There's such a debate on metrics. What are the right metrics? What is the right velocity we need to get? Why does the burn down? We need to fix it all, right? Somebody's going to look at it and get mad at us. This is stemming from your learnings way back when you were in school. So I'm like, man, what did I do? Now, to be really honest, I don't feel responsible for everything. I didn't create industrialization, but I realized that we are going way in the wrong direction. And although I left public education in 2009, and I can't speak for what's going on now, I don't think it's changed very much. We are actually more keen to standardize tests now and making sure kids pass tests. And I'm often left wondering, why are we still doing that? Because it's really not that important. What is important is that we teach children who become adults to come up with solutions to complex problems. That is what's required of our global society now. And unfortunately, we are not doing this. Why? I guess it takes a long time to change, right? We know that. But the question I always have in mind is, are we scared to kind of let the folks who are the experts, the developers, so to speak, solve the problems? Are leaders really afraid of that? Are Scrum Masters really afraid of that? Because at the end of the day, the leaders are responsible for the business. So last thing here, let's go a layer deeper, right? Because we want to talk about some of the more subconscious, subtle things that you've picked up along the way in your education that are cemented there that you don't even realize it. And Mark, this may be where I need your help, facilitating some stuff in the chat. So I did a Google search and I said, show me some pictures of the scientific method. And I just took a screenshot here of a whole bunch of things at once. because this is essentially what I saw. And these were typical posters that I would have up in my classroom, whether a middle school teacher or an elementary school teacher. And I noticed something about them now that I have fresh eyes looking at this. And I want to see, does the audience see what I'm seeing? What do you notice about these posters?
We see very linear.
Very linear. They're dependent upon each other in order to get to the next step.
Yes. Terrible use of color. Yes. They're very prescriptive. Absolutely. This makes the scientific method look like a linear process. So whether you are aware of this or not, whether we talk about this or not, this is cemented in your brain. It's hardwired in there that this is a series of steps that you have to follow, and then that's it. And I'm looking at this and I'm like, I had my students memorize this. We just memorize the steps. They spit it out on a test. And then what? We weren't even doing anything to remotely follow this. Did we ever observe anything? Did we ever ask a question? Did they ever come up with their own solutions? No, I was having them follow cookbook recipes. So I'm taking ownership of this today and saying that we fundamentally have to change even the smallest things that we're putting in front of people. Here's an interesting one that I found. And I'm just like, wow, okay, we're headed in the right direction. What's the problem with this one?
It's not continuous.
You're muted, Patty.
Sorry for that. We're going in the right direction with this one, right? It's somehow iterative. There's a circular process. However, where's that last arrow that connects the results with the observation of the results? And what do the results mean? And should we keep going with our testing and learning? It's like, it's still linear. So I don't know, this didn't solve the problem. But I will tell you, in looking around the internet, there were a few out there. I was super excited to see this on a few teachers' websites and schools' websites that were actually more true to form of the scientific method. So I was really pumped to see this. And of course, I can't ask the person who posted this on their website, but I am curious. Are you teaching this and actually doing it in your classroom? Are we saying one thing and doing something else? That is something we always have to check within ourselves. We have to walk the walk. So with this being said, a little bit more accurate to what we're looking at in terms of Agile and Scrum, where do your teams get stuck with this? Where do you think they bump up against an impediment? The experiment. Okay, the green part right here. Aha. And ask a question. When I looked at this and I started thinking about this myself, that is the first thing I thought of. How many people feel safe even asking a question? Because I will tell you, like I've had this comparison with teaching in a company or a corporation versus teaching in a school. It is the same thing. Everybody is deathly afraid of raising their hand and asking a question because they're afraid that they're wrong. They're going to be made fun of. Somebody's going to shut them down. don't ask that question, cut them off. Whatever the fears are that are in their head, that prevents people from raising their hand and asking. They don't want to be wrong. This again stems back from elementary school, when people might have laughed at you for asking a question, or maybe even the teacher, right? We're not blameless here. Don't ask questions. We don't have time for questions. Parents might do this to their children. Stop asking why. We've got to move on with our day here. The curiosity and the questioning and those types of things are kind of taught out of us when we are young. And this is what you need to foster in your team. And we always talk about psychological safety, but making people feel safe to wonder, to ponder, to ask big questions. Yes, we jump straight into solutioning. We skip everything else. Are we asking the right question, right? Before we start solutioning. And sometimes we don't want to spend the time there because we got to just get the work out the door, right? But I wanted to not just be negative around this, because I know that there are teams that are out there that are doing this really well. So I wanted to throw this out to the audience. Does anybody have an example of where your team is doing this really well? You can share that with us, and maybe what helps them get to that point where they do feel safe doing this. Feel free to call out if you'd like. Hopefully somebody can feel safe sharing their story here. Yeah, emphasizing teamwork, which requires communication and working together. These are I think, formerly known as soft skills, but there's a bit of a rebrand around that to power skills. These are the skills that are required for us to be successful team members. Again, thinking back to education, it's kind of like everybody out for themselves, right? Climbing up the ranks, graduating the top of the class. And I speak from experience because I was one of those people. That's what's important, where it's like you got to kind of clear everybody out of the way to get to the top. This is a different way of working, and it requires a different way of thinking as well as a different way of acting. Yeah. And soft skills, I think they're becoming more in the forefront of discussion, but they're often seen as, yeah, of course we know how to coach, right? Anybody can coach. Coaching takes time. It really does, time and experience. So soft skills are not so easy. All right, let's keep this moving. I want to keep an eye on my time. All right, so I mentioned that from my perspective, what can I offer you as some tips or some things to consider when you're approaching your team members or your team as a whole to help build a safer experimentation culture? The first one, we've all seen this before. This is probably familiar. Some of us may have never gotten one of these in our life. I would say be careful of your word choice. Just say no to things like fail fast, fail forward. Anything with the word fail triggers people. It brings people back to this, whether it is some perfectionist tendencies, the fear of failure, I've got to be perfect, I can't fail, and the anxiety that produces, that's one case. The other flip side of it is the folks that couldn't or didn't want to be that memorize stuff and spit it out for a test to get an A. And they may have, according to the schools, been a failure, and this may have been in their face all the time. So again, whether they're conscious of it or not, this word is bringing them back to those places. So just being very mindful that you use different language, like test and learn. There's no judgment there. The other thing, understanding that the fear of experimentation is hardwired into people. And just like any hardwired behavior, it takes a lot of patience and time to coach people into a different way of thinking and a different way of working. So meeting people where they're at and having empathy for that will carry you really far. Because remember, we have been taught that reproducing somebody else's work, somebody else's number, somebody else's what have you, is the true measure of success. And we know that is just not true anymore. We are trying to work together to produce a successful product for our customer. We are not trying to turn up the conveyor belt and work faster so more widgets come off the assembly line. That's just not the nature of much of human work anymore. So understanding that people are still thinking that way, we have to kind of help them undo that. And that takes a lot. And awareness is really the first step to it. And kind of along those lines is keeping in mind that people may have little true experience with experimentation. As I mentioned in our science lab example and all these labs that I did with my students, that was not true experimentation. So maybe with your teams, show them the scientific method, right? Laugh about it. I know you saw this in school. Let's talk about it. Just like I did here, like, this is what you learn. It was very linear, but here's what it's really like. And let's talk about it. Make sure they understand that it's just not a series of finite steps to memorize. And have an honest conversation about their fears around doing it. Where do they think they get stuck in this process and why? And what can they do collaborative as a team to overcome that impediment? Whether that's, within themselves as a team or something external to the team. And maybe as a group, have them do some type of activity. Have them take one of their current challenges, whether it's a feature that they're building, or whether it's just a personal impediment they're dealing with. Have them take that through the scientific method and talk through it. And see if they can get used to thinking that way and working through their problems in that way, because it is a muscle to build. The next one is to advocate for your team. Build relationships with people who are an impediment to your team experimenting. And as a Scrum Master, this is where you may need to go outside your team and talk to other members of your organization. And I don't mean from the perspective of telling them, you're doing this to my team. Get to know them as human beings. Understand where they're coming from. Where are their challenges with allowing your team to experiment? And then maybe help them understand what your team is struggling with. And you can have the conversations with the team, have the conversations with the people outside of the team, and maybe at some point, these folks can come to the same table and feel safe enough to have a conversation together about increasing the experimentation culture. But this is about building relationships with people and getting them to see that you're on their side. You're not trying to, as we say in the community, force anything on anybody. You're trying to start dialogue so we can all make positive changes for the company together. And get support from leaders. So continuing with this idea, what are their fears around experimentation? And I mentioned this back in the beginning of the presentation. their butt is on the line, that for the P&L, the profit and loss of the company. They need to answer to stakeholders, bigger stakeholders, shareholders. They don't want to fail either. So there is real fear around that. But it would be good for you to understand that. So when you're having conversations with them, you can have empathy for that. But the other piece is, are what they are talking about real? Is their fear real? Because 80% of the thoughts that go on in your head all day are the same, and most of them are not true. They don't end up happening. So having some conversations around that. And again, it's, having the confidence and courage to approach people outside your team, people that are up the chain, so to speak, in the organization, takes a lot of guts. It takes courage. It's not easy, but start with small steps. And keep in mind, like I said, that leaders and people in the higher levels of the organization are concerned with time. They are concerned with money. They are concerned with losing competitive edge. And as we've seen recently, this merry-go-round of talent coming in and leaving and coming in and leaving, and this is costing companies a great deal of money. Can you have conversations with them about that? Because this is their why. The warm and fuzzies might not be their why, right? They're concerned about this. And helping them or having conversations around them in a way that they understand helps them understand that experimentation culture is actually, the lack of experimentation culture is actually hindering the company in these areas that they're concerned about. And the final point here is, understanding people is the key to developing an experimentation culture. If you can crack this code, understanding people, what's going on in their head, what makes them tick, you can understand how to coach them from that place. So understanding what motivates them. What do people fear the most? What are their biases and prior experiences with failure that are triggering them to not want to experiment? If you can really get your mind around this and start some dialogue around this, you will help your organization make great strides in the direction of success with Scrum. So that is my spiel for today. I want to open up the floor to questions and answers. I will stop sharing my screen and, bounce ideas off me, ask me to clarify, whatever it is, I'm here.
So Patty, we do have a question in the chat. I'll just go ahead and read it for you from Karen. Karen says, how do you shift from a mindset of getting the right answers to getting the right results, especially with leadership, taking the leap in a union environment? What are your perspectives on OKRs?
Yes, we all love our numbers, right? Numbers speak a story. I think it's just having them, this is like, it's a big can of worms, and it's not something that you can solve in, a quick answer or 30 minutes. It's what I always come back to, and sometimes I feel like a broken record. It is building relationships with people and then asking them powerful questions. What are these metrics saying to you? The way we're doing things, are they actually getting you the results that you want? If your customers are looking for innovative products, are we delivering those? What's the root cause of it if we are not? And helping them dig through the layers to find out that maybe people don't feel safe testing and learning in this company. So I think it's about just continuing that conversation and helping leaders really verbalize whether this is going on or not. Because as I mentioned in the beginning, we just do the same things over and over because they feel safe, and we have the same talking points and we say the same things. But is it really working for us?
So Patty, Jamie had a good comment here where she said, meet them where they are at.
Yeah.
And then bring them along the
Right.
journey with you. I thought that was great. Muhammad has a question. He asks, how do you change your team's mindset on letting you coach them when you are younger than them?
That ageism is real, right? And you can also say the same thing about folks that might be in a later stage of their career. Same thing. The younger folks will think the older folks don't get me. They didn't grow up how I grew up, right? We all have this story, this generational wars, right? I think before you attempt to coach people, they have to understand who you are, what your values are, and where you come from. And if they see that you're there, I always come back to forcing Scrum on people. If they see that you're on their side and you're not trying to force them to change, because nobody wants to be forced, and you're just honest and vulnerable, and you speak from experience, and you talk about, how you failed and overcome it, people will see you're a human being, and then they start listening to you about other things. So I've learned to come up in front of a group of strangers and admit my failures. But I also talk about what I've learned from them and how I'm doing different things differently now. And once people see that I'm willing to do that, and I try, and I'm not perfect, but I try to walk the walk, people will see that maybe you're somebody worth listening to, and you kind of know some things. And I just truly believe that everybody's experience and perspective is valuable. So I think you need to let them take the pressure off of yourself. And I'm making an assumption you're asking for yourself, but take the pressure off yourself on having to coach them and get them to some result. Just show them who you are as a person.
Nice. All right, Patty. So Osasogi has been very patient, having her virtual hand raised. So we'll get to her next.
I see.
Thank you, everyone. So I think Patty just answered my question in parts, but I'll give like a scenario. So I just joined a team newly. The team is not new, obviously, but the project that they're working on is a new one. And the team dynamics has it that the tech lead, he's very knowledgeable, right? So they all draw knowledge from him, let me use that word. And now as a result, there isn't a lot of conversation going on within the team. So it's more him giving directions. Oh, let's do this, you do this, you do this. And everybody seems fine with it, even up to the story estimation. He's more like the voice. Oh, let's put that as an 8, or let's put that as a 5, and everybody seems fine. And I know Agile and Scrum is all about the interaction, the collaboration amongst the team. So how do I interject into this process and try to like encourage more interaction coming from the team, collaboration, and not just everyone looking up to him, because he really has a genuine heart to help and he's willing to take on as much load as possible. But I feel the team will do better when we start having the conversation. So at what point, what time is too early to interject? Because I'm in that loop. I just joined like, let's say about 3 weeks now. Is it too soon to be saying anything? Should I still sit back and just continue building that relationship like you said? Or that's just the loop I'm in now?
And so, Patty, if you can answer this one quickly, and then hopefully we'll have time
Sure,
for one more.
sure,
Jane's been very patient too.
Well, I was going to say, have we worked at the same company? I mean, this happens everywhere. And it's, I mean, assume positive intent, right? I mean, it's not that anybody is trying to cut anybody down or it's just, this is a dynamic that is there and you have to figure out how to balance it out. My first question to you, and I know we're short on time here because this probably would take hours to kind of pull this apart and answer this, right? Does this person know the effect they are having on the team? That's my first question. My second question is, do you think they're willing to accept responsibility that they might be silencing everybody else's voice? And you don't have to say it that way. I'm saying, do you think that they're at that point?
Okay. Good question.
I mean, don't go in there and start pointing out you're doing this wrong, like, right? But you have to, this person has to come to the conclusion somehow indirectly that they're doing all the talking and nobody else is doing any talking. And even though the team probably acts like they're okay with it, my guess is they're not.
Awesome.
So if you can poke at the team members and see what they think about it, gentle at first, of course, get them to answer that question. Are they really okay with that? Like truly internally?
Thanks, Osasogi.
Yeah, I know we're at like.
And thanks, Patty. All right, last one real quick.
Sure,
Lightning
sure.
round, Jane.
Okay, I just want to make a comment, and I just read Jamie's message about just basically experimenting, and some people they just won't fall in wherever. Particularly at my job, they've done meetings a certain kind of way. They just get on Teams and hop in with different things. And I decided to do a Kanban board because they're not used to change. They don't want to change how they do things. And I realized I just kept doing what I was doing, and I got positive responses. And then people would send me messages about good meeting, good meeting. My goal was to go straight to the point. To show results of what we're doing from month to month, and then to basically like have shorter meetings. And so I think if you just kind of stay confident and do what you're doing, you're gonna meet some resistance, but it has worked for me. And I think some of these meetings that I have with Scrum Master Universe and everything, following people on LinkedIn has really helped me. So just keep doing what you're doing. You're gonna always have people that's gonna be a little difficult.
Always going to have people that are difficult, right? Wouldn't you say, Patty?
Yeah. That's why I said these companies are different. They operate differently. Like there's so many differences between one company to the next. But it just seems like no matter where I go, the challenges are still the same. Because you're dealing with human beings. They're used to doing things the same way. And you're asking them to do something different. So,
yep.
I mean, that's kind of what it boils down to.
So, Patty, we could probably go on for another couple hours with questions here. Yeah, I see people chatting in here. You know, Karen says, so glad I dedicated time to this worthwhile session. So many factors and backstories to understand.
Right.
You going to come back for a third time, Patty?
I am.
All right.
Let me like incubate my next idea.
I was
Awesome.
thinking even a deeper dive on this topic, Patty, really just like part two, like in terms of, it's kind of like you gave us, the what and the so what, and now we could have a whole conversation on the now what. Now what do we do with this information?
Now what do we do with this?
And how do we all have these unique challenges, and well, maybe not even unique. We probably have some shared challenges that we could take a deeper dive into, and how do we get there, right? And
right.
So
because this is all complex. It's all
very,
very, very, very, very complex, and it's hard to answer the question on a very deep level, right? So, yeah, great idea.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time,
Yes.
but what a great close to the work week and heading to the weekend. Patty, thank you so much for being our guest again. I did notice there were a few people who joined like right at the last minute, fear not, this whole thing's been recorded, so you'll get the recording, and Patty's given the okay to that as well as the slides, so you all will get that. All right, y'all, we're going to land it there. Thanks a lot, everybody. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you next time. All right. Thanks, Patty.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.